Hey folks, welcome in. This is Chris with Alpenglow Digital, and in today's video, we're going to talk about variables in Power Apps. We're going to cover three of the most common variable types. Firstly, we're going to touch on named formulas, which allows you to define some data up front in your application. This is for data that cannot change throughout your application. So for this example, we set this little user image up here on the right to the logged in user image. It's not something that we need to change throughout our application. The second type of variable is a global variable, which is defined using the set function. For this example, we have our steps down here at the bottom that are changed kind of dynamically based on the current screen that the user is on. And the third is a local or context variable that is set and updated using the update context function. And for this example, we have a nice little pop-up that allows the user to see some more information and then close out. And that's using kind of a variable value to toggle it off and on. So without further ado, let's go. Hey folks, welcome to Power Apps. Before we jump into using variables, I just want to give you a quick overview of how this dummy application is set up. We have three screens and we have the ability to kind of step between them here. I was trying to kind of envision a multi-step form. If you had a kind of a real world scenario where that made sense, what you may decide to do is, instead of using separate screens, is just use maybe a single screen and container and kind of toggle between the containers with each kind of step in the process. But for the purpose of illustrating how variables worked, I am going to use separate screens for all of these. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to focus on the kind of three types of variables. Power Apps does have a few more, but we're going to focus on the set variable, which allows you to add a global variable to your application that you can read and change throughout your application. We're going to use a named formula, which allows you to define the variable once when the app first starts, and you cannot change it throughout your application. And then last is what I consider kind of a local variable. It's called a context variable, and it is scoped to just a specific screen. So let's start with kind of an easy one. We're going to use a named formula, which allows us to define either formulas, or you can kind of use variables, and they can be used throughout your application and they cannot be changed. So you'd want to use this for information that you maybe want to pull in when the app starts, but you don't need it to act as a way to manage global state or do any of those things that you would need to change it throughout the application. So for this example, I have this little icon up here in the top right, and I want this to be the user's image that is logged in to Power Apps. So I have it on each of the screens here, and I want it to just reference kind of a variable. And so what I'm going to do here is, if you click on app, there's a drop down called formulas. You can do some things on start. We did this in a previous video. If you wanted to declare some global variables that you anticipate changing, you could do those in the on start property. But the formulas property allows you to define things that are immutable, meaning they can't be changed elsewhere in your application. And so in this case, the user's image is not going to change, so it seems like a good use case for that. So I'm going to declare a variable. It's going to be called user image, and we are going to use the user function, which comes with Power Apps. And that allows you to get some information about the logged in user. You can get their email, full name, depending on kind of what auth servers they might be using. We're using Microsoft Entra. You might get some information about that, and then an image. And it will require that you close this out with a semicolon, because they do anticipate you using several formulas in this space right here. So we have a user image, and now let's take that variable and let's use that for our image up here. So instead of this little GUID we got from one of the stock images, we're going to clear that out and we're going to use our image. So I grabbed my image, and we're going to do the same thing here. Again, in a real example, you may not use multiple screens in this way, and so therefore you might have a constant header, and you don't need to do this several times. But that is all there is to it. So if we tried to change the value of user image, say on a button click, or if you went to a specific screen on the onVisible property, that would not be doable because it is considered a formula and therefore immutable. Next, let's take a quick look at set. So set allows you to define and use a global variable, which means that it can be read on any of your screens and changed from any of your screens. And for this example, again, since we have 3 screens, I want to change this kind of step number to be kind of dynamic based on what screen it is on. And so in this case, I'm on step screen 1, 2, 3. So in 1, let's say on the visibility property, on visible, when somebody lands on this page, I want to use the set property, and I want to define, again, this can be any name you want, something called current step, and I want it to be a number. So in this case, it's 1. So when somebody lands on this screen, this variable is created, where if it exists already, the value is set to 1. And then down here, where I have just this string, what I'm going to do is just concatenate some things together. So step, and I'm using ampersand, and I'm going to feed it the current step, and I'm going to have it out of 3. So again, this is string. We're feeding it a variable, and then concatenating a string on the end of it. So you'll see that you don't see anything down here yet, and that's because we need to leave this screen and come back to it for the on visible property kind of trigger. So if we go here, and we come back, you can now see step 1 out of 3. So let's do that same thing for the other screens really quickly. So here, I'm going to do this, and then on my third screen, I'm going to use the same formula. And so now what we need to do is tell Power Apps, hey, when somebody lands on the second screen, we're going to use kind of this same setup where we are setting current step to a value. And on the second screen, let's do on visible, we want to now set it to 2 because you're kind of in the second step of the process. And then in our third screen, we want this to be set to 3 to indicate that you're on the final step. So if we go back and play this, you're right here on the first screen, step 1 out of 3. On here, you're on the second screen, 2 out of 3, and the final screen is 3 out of 3. So because this is a global variable, it can be referenced on multiple screens. The value can be read, and it can be augmented. So if this was a formula, you could not change this value on any of the screens, but because it's just a global variable using set, you can use it across multiple screens. All right, we're back here on the first screen, and I want to show an example of how to use a local variable, or what they call context variables, in Power Apps. So these are variables that are just used within a particular screen. The values cannot be read from other screens or changed from other screens. They're just really used for this single screen experience. And if you do need something to be used elsewhere, then you should use likely a global variable. So in this case, I have a group of elements here that I'm calling pop-up. And if we make them all visible, this is kind of like a more information pop-up that you might see in many other web experiences. And what I want to have happen is for this to be visible when the user clicks this little information icon. And then when they click the backdrop or the closeout button, either this or this, I want this to disappear and for folks to see kind of this normal experience. So the first thing that I'm going to do is here on the little information icon, the onSelect property, I'm going to use a formula called update context. And it has a slightly different format than set does. So it's expecting a value within curly braces called a record value. And instead of using like a current step, we had current step comma, it uses a different kind of setup. It uses a colon instead. So what I want to call this is maybe pop-up viz, and use a colon. And then we're going to set that visibility to true when this is clicked. So now what we need to do is update our pop-up. So the visibility property references pop-up viz rather than false or true explicitly. So instead of here, I want this to reference pop-up viz, which again it doesn't have a value when you first land here, so it's going to be false. And then when you click here, this changes things to be true, and therefore our pop-up shows. So the next step is for us to ensure that when somebody clicks the backdrop or the little X button here, that this experience disappears and folks see the original screen the way it was before they click the button. So here in our button, I'm going to change the onSelect property. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to call update context, and we're going to feed it a record. And we're going to have it be the same name because this is the same variable that we're referencing. I think we called it pop-up viz. And now we want that to be false. So I actually don't know why it disappeared initially, but here, We'll toggle it true, so this all shows. Toggle it false, it all disappears. So what I like to do is trying to anticipate how users might use this application. If they're going to click kind of on a backdrop, sometimes I expect that to also close the pop-up. So I'm going to take this same little onSelect property where we change the update or update context for the pop-up viz, and I'm going to add it to this rectangle, which is what I'm kind of using as my backdrop, if you will. So I'm going to change the onSelect property to this. So now if somebody's in here, they can click this and it disappears. They can also click the X button specifically and it also disappears. And this creates a nice little experience if you want to provide users with more information, but you don't want to cram your initial screen. Folks have the ability to kind of toggle things on and off. So one other thing that's worth pointing out, as we mentioned before, this is scoped to your specific screen. So say I wanted to reference this property or this variable on like the second screen. So if I add just a little text box here, instead of text, I want it to reference pop-up viz, it will say that it isn't valid and the pop-up viz isn't recognized. And that's because it belongs to the step 1 screen and it is scoped specifically to this screen. Before we get out of here, I do want to show you the variables tab. So over here on the left where you have the tree view and your data tab, there's a variables tab. And this shows you all of the variable types that Power Apps can use. We didn't cover the component variables or collections. These have a little bit more niche use cases that if you're doing kind of simple applications, you may not rely on those. But if you click here and learn more, it gives you a nice quick definition and then also links off to Microsoft's site, which goes much more in depth. And they can be very useful, again, depending on your use case. But for our more simple use case, we are just using global variables, formulas, and context variables. So you can see under global variables, I have my current step, and it also shows you the current value of it. And you can see where it is referenced. So in this case, each of the screens on the onVisible property does change the definition for our current step variable. And then our named formula just has the user image, and then our single context variable on our first step screen is referenced here. It's called pop-up viz. And so this is a nice way if you are working with a team or you're just creating like an MVP and then later you want to go and change a name and you're like, I don't know where did I reference pop-up viz at? You can punch it in here. You can see, oh, here it was in step 1. And then you can actually click into it and it will take you right to the location where it's referenced on each of these. And so if you wanted to change the name or just better understand how your variables are used throughout your application, this is a great way to do it. Alrighty, folks, that does it for our quick overview of variables in Power Apps. I think when you're deciding what type of variable makes the most sense, first think about whether or not you will need to update it throughout your application. If you don't, like we did for the image in this example, then maybe using a named formula to define some data when your app first load makes the most sense. If you do need to update it, think about whether or not it can just live on a single screen, like we have for our more information toggle. And if so, maybe a local or context variable makes the most sense. And if you do want to manage global state or track where a user is at in the process and you do need it to be read or updated across multiple screens, then using set to define and update a global variable probably makes the most sense. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.